this joint meeting of the Health and Human Services, Economic Development, and General Government Committee. We are here today on Wednesday, May 5th, for this virtual meeting, which is being run virtually with the assistance of Focus Springfield and in compliance with the open meeting law as ordered by the governor, is being recorded and will be placed for public view on the municipal YouTube page. So we're grateful to Focus Springfield. I'm City Councilor Jesse Letterman, Chairman of the Health and Human Services Committee. I'm joined by my colleague, Chairman of the General Government Committee, Melvin Edwards, and Chairman of the Economic Development Committee, Malo Brown. And we'll hear from them momentarily. We are also joined by our colleagues who are, Councilor Gomez from Ward 1, Councilor Tim Allen from Ward 7, Councilor Sean Curran, who's a member of the Health and Human Services Committee, at-large councilor. And so we are here with one agenda item, which is a presentation on the recently released Greater Springfield Housing Analysis Report. And that is a report that was conducted by the UMass Donahue Institute and Wayfinders. Looking very forward to hearing about the report from our guests, Keith Ferry, CEO of Wayfinders, and Dr. Melnick from the UMass Donahue Institute. And I remember meeting with Peter Gagliardi a couple years ago when he was first telling us when this was getting started. Councilor Edwards and I had met with him, and he was very excited about it. So it's fantastic to see it come to fruition. And certainly this is extraordinarily topical today because of the crisis that we've been experiencing with the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think we all know that that crisis is not limited to the pandemic. There certainly has been a crisis developing in the Commonwealth and in Western Massachusetts in a way that I think does not or has not been talked about in the same way as what was occurring in the way they speak about it in Eastern Massachusetts. So we're really grateful for the report and looking forward to hearing the results on it. It gives us some of the data that we need to be able to take action at the local level. I also want to thank Jerry McCafferty, our Director of Housing for the City of Springfield, who's here, and she's certainly heard the report several times before, so we're glad she'll be here to answer questions, and Director of Economic Development, Tim Sheehan. So with that, I do want to give my co-chairs, Councilor Edwards and Councilor Brown, a quick moment to say hello, and then we will turn it over to our panelists for the presentation, and then following the presentation, we'll take questions from councilors. So Councilor Edwards, did you want to make any remarks?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for their attendance and their due diligence in putting this together. I'm eager to hear the details of the report, and I'm very appreciative of Wayfinders and their staff for their efforts on this behalf. Yes, Councilor Letterman and I met considerable time ago with your former executive director. We emphasized the need for this. I know Jerry McCaffrey for many years, and the due diligence she's put into these issues, and I'm really happy to see some of my other colleagues from the council here today to learn more about it as well. So thank you everybody that was involved. I sincerely appreciate all the work that's been done to this point.
Thank you, Councilor Edwards. Councilor Brown, did you want to make any opening remarks?
Yes. Thank you, Councilor Letterman. I want to thank also everyone for attending the meeting. I also want to thank my two colleagues, Councilor Letterman and you got to be quiet, baby. Edwards and Councilor Edwards on the work that they've been doing. I definitely want to thank Keith from Wayfinders. I'm glad that you're here. I'm looking forward to getting the information, something that we really do need. And thank you, guys.
Thank you, Councilor Brown. So we'll turn things over, as I said, to our panelists. Again, we have Keith Ferry, Executive Director of Wayfinders. Very grateful not only for you being here today, Keith, but also everything you and Wayfinders have done throughout this pandemic. And also Dr. Mark Melnick from UMass Donahue Institute. So at this time, we'll welcome them to introduce their team and give their presentation.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity today. I'm going to open up with some remarks and then turn it over to Mark. So as I've already been announced, I'm Keith Ferry, the president and CEO of Wayfinders. I took over for Peter in July of 2020. So coming up quickly on a year here, and what a year it's been. As already mentioned, Wayfinders has been working with the UMass Donahue Institute, but also with the Community Foundation of Western Massachusetts and the Greater Springfield Housing Advisory Committee, and for more than a year to bring this important study to light. So thanks for the opportunity to present the findings and analysis from the Greater Springfield Housing Study. Before I turn over to Mark, I'd like to take a quick moment to give you some things to consider during the presentation. I'd like you to think about the importance of housing to the recovery and future success of the city of Springfield. Undoubtedly, given your role as counselors, you all have a vision for the future. My vision for the city and for the region is one of becoming an equitable, inclusive, and economically thriving place. I hope those words resonate for you, at least in part of your vision. I hope at least some of those characteristics, equitable, inclusive, and economically thriving, resonate for you. As we think about this, in order for us to achieve that goal, and undoubtedly your goals, we must ask ourselves, what must we invest in to support our people, our coworkers, the grocery store clerk, the teachers, the nurses, the mechanics, people currently living in poverty in our region, communities of color, communities without access to broadband, our business and institutional government officials, and other stakeholders. Who is already thriving, and what do we need to do to get everybody there? What has always been the case, and what we've learned again over the last year, is that where we live, our home, is central to our health, economic, and educational success and well-being. That's both individually and collectively. And right now, we have an amazing opportunity to pursue the goal of a thriving community, inclusive of a diverse mix of housing choices for all the people of the city of Springfield, and I hope for the region overall. And the housing study comes at a perfect time to help us understand where we need to target our investments of time, capacity, and resources to secure that future. So as you take in the data from the report, consider how you'd like the city to deploy the federal, state, and local resources to achieve the vision you have for the city. If it's like mine, an equitable, inclusive, and economically thriving place, I think there's lots to invest in and lots to prioritize and think about right now, especially with the unprecedented resources from the American Rescue Plan Act and potentially from an infrastructure or American Jobs Plan that the Biden administration is pushing. And so I would say to you, how can we use the data from the study to inform the housing investments that will get us to the outcome that we all want? The housing study was initially undertaken in pre-pandemic times, as we've already discussed here, with a regional advisory group of leaders from Hamden, Hampshire, and Franklin counties. The goal of the study was to develop a better understanding of what was happening in the housing market in the region. Were rents and prices increasing? If so, where? If rents and prices were increasing, was it pricing families out of communities? What demographic shifts were occurring in the community? And was our housing supply adequate to meet the needs of the population? All of these questions were part of the initial line of inquiry. Once the data was revealed, the plan was and is to share that for all community stakeholders to understand. Our hope is that the data will provide some clarity about what is happening and then direct us to the issues that we need to work on and solve for. So with all that, let me turn it over to our terrific research partner for the study, Mark Melnick from the UMass Donahue Institute, to share more about their findings and analysis. Mark, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Keith. Let me share my screen. All right, you guys see it all right? Excellent.
Yeah.
My name is Mark Melnick. I direct economic and public policy research at the UMass Donahue Institute. First, let me thank you all for inviting me here this evening to share this work with you. And I also wanted to acknowledge one of the folks who are here today as a looky-loo, but my associate director, Carolyn Ann McGowan, one of my bosses, checking up on me and seeing some of the work that we've been doing over the last year plus. This project has really been an incredible labor of love and something that we really enjoyed, and it's been exciting for us to be able to to get in and share this information with the broader public. The chat function was shut off, and I was going to share a link to the study, but one of the things I do want to highlight right off the top and encourage all the counselors to go and find the study and look at it is we have limited time to share data and results today. The study is about 52 pages. The deck I work from has about 80 some odd slides. And so the presentation will not be that, and I'm only going to talk for about 15 or so minutes. So there's a lot that's left on the cutting room floor. But what I wanted to frame for you all here, and I think Keith does such a wonderful job of it at the top, has been the way in which we approached housing as a core economic development and social mobility vehicle within a community, and how that is so important and systemic to all other elements of social life. One of the things that we imagined out of this project, both when Peter Gagliardi was at Wayfinders and then as we moved ahead, was a type of project where we could go look at a regional housing market and looking at the Pioneer Valley as a holistic thing, and seeing what the different housing challenges there are within the community, similar to what is seen out of the Greater Boston Housing Report Card. Today's study is a phase one of a two-phase approach for this year. And I like to think about those two projects as being linked together in that phase one and phase two. A lot of what we've been doing to date has really been steered and guided, and we've gotten a lot of great advice and guidance from Keith's team at Wayfinders and the folks from the Community Foundation of Western Mass, and Jerry and others on the advisory committee. And I thank all those folks for the contributions that they've made. The picture that we went into this project kind of has three main verticals to it. The first was thinking about what was going on specifically inside the Pioneer Valley. We knew that the economic recovery post the Great Recession had considerably lagged in Western Massachusetts and the Pioneer Valley compared to the rest of the state. That said, the housing market appeared to be heating up after the crash, raising serious questions about affordability in a part of the state that had traditionally, at least by Massachusetts standards, been a lower cost part of the state. And we know the Valley is a diverse place, but at the same time, many parts of the Valley have become less affordable for people who have historically lived here. So that was one of the big opening questions for us. And then the kickoff meeting for this project was first week of March 2020. So a significant curveball was thrown at us shortly thereafter, which was in thinking about COVID-19 within all of this. And in particular, the health and economic impacts of the pandemic and how they had impacted people who are most vulnerable already. And enhanced crisis, particularly for housing vulnerability. Lastly, COVID-19 really highlighted some of the existing vulnerabilities in society in general. What we found was lower income residents were much more likely to be living in multi-generational or crowded housing, were communities that were more likely to have a wider spread of the pandemic. People who were in traditionally low wage, low skill jobs were also the ones who were most likely to be laid off during the pandemic, and what those things meant for vulnerability in general. But for us, we wanted to think about this as place, in its factors as social determinants of health and our access to opportunity, the role that place and community play for stability and economic mobility, and as I noted already, the pandemic spotlight on existing vulnerabilities. So that was the holistic framework that we've been working under, and the importance of housing center within all of that, and place within all of that. In terms of our phase one study, some of the core things that we walk away with, first on the economic and demographic side, is that there are economic challenges in the Pioneer Valley and Western Massachusetts. There's large variation across the area with the economic crises hitting poor places harder and recovering slower. And that there are significant differences in the housing market for owners and renters, urban and suburban, et cetera. And that there are income differences by race, and this is a key factor in understanding affordability and stability. And I'll go into this later in the study when we look at things around housing burden, particularly as it relates to owners and renters and who tend to be owners and renters. In terms of the housing market, our pre-COVID models project a housing supply gap in the region over the next 5 years. And part of that is, even though the population growth has been slow in the Pioneer Valley, the aging of the population in general and the makeup of household formation means that we'll actually have a supply gap in housing. And we're seeing some of that already in the way the housing prices have been heating up. Overall prices were gently increasing pre-COVID. And then this other factor that is significant within Springfield in particular is the older housing stock increases the chances of a dilapidated housing, particularly in the rental market. And then lastly, on affordability and stability, affordability is a pressing concern, especially for renters. There was a foreclosure crisis continuing in Springfield, even as we were in the economic recovery post the Great Recession. And rental vacancies were decreasing in Hampton, but increasing a bit in other places, and that having an impact on prices as well. So first, looking at the Pioneer Valley socioeconomic characteristics, and I'm going to be going through a handful of different data points here. We can save questions for the end, but this is a small crowd, so I'm more than happy to field questions within slides too. So whatever's comfortable for the counselors is comfortable for me in this situation. So if something isn't clear, please feel free to ask.
That's fine. If you have a question on the data, just pop your hand up, and I've got the queue open, so we'll go right to folks.
Okay, great. So the first slide I have here looks at the percent of the population below poverty by race and ethnicity using the American Community Survey. The core thing we want to highlight in here is that the percent of the population in poverty in the Pioneer Valley is elevated compared to other parts of Massachusetts. The poverty rate in the state pre-pandemic was about 11%. For Pioneer Valley, it was 16%. In our individual counties within Pioneer Valley, Franklin had low poverty rates of about 10.4, Hampshire 13.3, and then Hampden County 17.1. What we see though is for each individual racial group within the Pioneer Valley, we have elevated poverty rates. And those elevated poverty rates stand out in particular within Hampden County. There's a little bit of noise within this graphic because we show the poverty rates for different racial groups within the counties. For example, Franklin County, we have a very high poverty rate for the Black population in Franklin County. Should be noticed also a very small Black population in Franklin County. So there may be a little bit of data noise there. But this graphic gives the impression that each area is the same size, and that isn't the case. We know Hampden is a much more significant population center than Franklin County, for example. But the core thing to take away from this here is that poverty rates are elevated in the Pioneer Valley in general, and that it is acutely an issue within the Black, African American, and Latinx communities. Turning towards unemployment in the pandemic, this graphic is something that you guys would be quite familiar with at this point, but we see the unemployment rates in Massachusetts, Pioneer Valley, and Hampden County dating back to 2007. And as we saw throughout the economic recovery post the Great Recession, unemployment rates continued to go down in Massachusetts and were quite low, just hovering around 2.5% right before the pandemic started. Both Hampden County and Pioneer Valley had elevated unemployment rates compared to Massachusetts, but they were quite low before the pandemic. And then what we see here in March is this dramatic increase in the unemployment rate everywhere, but Hampden County in particular being higher. Massachusetts in the summer had the highest unemployment rate in the country, which was a very odd place for us to be after many years of having one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country. Over the last two quarters, the last several quarters, but this quarter, most recent quarter in particular, Massachusetts' economy has been recovering very quickly, but that experience is not felt evenly across the state, and in part because of the industries that have been able to work remotely and those that have been harmed by restrictions through social distancing and so on around the pandemic. And we see this still elevated level of unemployment for Hampden County as an example. one of the things that we've highlighted in various aspects of work, and we highlight in the study in particular, is the uneven nature of the economic crisis that has occurred as a result of COVID-19. This graphic here looks at the makeup of folks who are applying for unemployment insurance before the pandemic, and the demographic makeup of folks who are applying for it during the pandemic. What stands out right now is that women, young adults, folks with limited educational attainment, and people of color have been disproportionately impacted by the economic downturn that has resulted by COVID-19. This has exacerbated elements of social inequality, and a lot of this is tied to the industries that have been most negatively impacted. We know that industries that require face-to-face interaction, food services, hotels, other types of leisure activities, these tend to be low-paying industries that rely a lot on younger workers, have a lot of immigrants and people of color working in them. Well, these were the industries that were most likely to be shut down and continue to be operating at a much reduced level today. Also, other forms of personal service. You think about barbershops, nail salons, hair salon, massage, dry cleaning. These are all kinds of services that have really been damaged by the pandemic. Thinking about gender, we've seen a total flip in terms of the percentage of people who have been applying for unemployment, where before the pandemic, 57% of unemployment claimants were men. Now, 54% of unemployment claimants are women. 54% of unemployment claimants have less than a bachelor's degree. And then interestingly, in the Pioneer Valley, we see about the same distribution pre and post pandemic when it comes to white folks applying for unemployment versus people of color. But what is really notable here is that whether pre-pandemic or post, we're seeing about 30 to 33% of unemployment claimants in Pioneer Valley being people of color. People of color only make up 15% of the Pioneer Valley's workforce. So we're seeing a proportion twice as much within our unemployment claimants. So these are the populations that have been made most vulnerable by the economic downturn that we've experienced over the last year. And this has obvious implications as it relates to housing because of the ability to make payments, particularly within our rental market. And as we would imagine, low-income residents and people of color are much more likely to be renters, particularly in Pioneer Valley, than in other parts of the state. Flipping to housing conditions, one of the things that gave rise to this study was a feeling that pre-pandemic, that something was changing in the local housing market in Greater Springfield, in the city of Springfield, in Pioneer Valley in general. One of the things that we would hear often, either in conversations with Peter when we were starting this project, another project we do right now is with the Mass Gaming Commission on the economic impacts of casinos in the host communities. But this concern about gentrification and what was happening to the prices within the housing market locally. This graphic here, which looks like a lot of spaghetti, but what is important to highlight here is that and the question of was the housing market changing, or is the housing market changing? The simple answer is yes. And in that, what we see is a clear decline in vacancy rates for both the rental market between 2010, the owner market between 2010 and today. And I think most interesting for the counselors here would be the orange line. This is City of Springfield. And we see among owners a vacancy rate of about 2% in 2010 and about just 1% today. And while that seems like a very small change, what this but low vacancy rates equal higher prices, right? And we're seeing that now even as the housing market is heated up post-pandemic. Similarly, when we look at the rental market in Springfield, we see a dramatic change in vacancies. About 8% vacancy rate in 2000 has turned into a 5% vacancy rate today. There's still available housing, but again, decreased vacancy rates is a signal of less supply and an increase in prices. A couple of the counties that we see within Pioneer Valley have seen some increase in vacancies, but when we think about Hamden and the city of Springfield in particular, vacancy rates are going down. This next graphic looks at foreclosures, and in particular, the share of foreclosures between 2015 and 2009 as a percentage of owner-occupied units. What's important in the line graph, there's a lot happening here, but in the line graph, we're showing the trends of foreclosures between 2000 and 2019 for Franklin, Hampshire, and Hampden County. What's important to note here are several things. One, that foreclosures continued on post the end of the Great Recession. We see this dip, this significant dip here. Part of that was about banks getting paperwork square and being better aligned with new regulations as they related to foreclosures, but then we see this spike return in foreclosures. Springfield in particular having a significant challenge with foreclosures over that time period. Springfield has about 15% of the Pioneer Valley's owner-occupied homes, but account for 35% of the foreclosures in the region. So even during a strong economic times, pre-pandemic, foreclosures were a significant issue. Now, the COVID moratoriums on foreclosures and evictions have helped stall people being kicked out of their homes, but this only forefends the issue for already struggling homeowners for a while, and that those same challenges will represent themselves post-pandemic. So it's an important issue when we think about the local housing market, the city's housing market, and protecting people within and enhancing community stability. Next, I want to turn attention to housing stock and age of housing stock. Massachusetts stands out as having some of the oldest housing in the country. This graphic here shows the percent of housing that was built pre-World War II, pre-1970, and then 1970 and later. In the United States, 60% of housing was built after 1970. In Massachusetts, we're the exact opposite, where 40% of our housing has been built after 1970. Pioneer Valley's housing is even older than that, where 37% was built after 1970. And in some of our communities, particularly Springfield, we have really old housing stock. So in Springfield's case, only a quarter was built after 1970, 40% pre-World War II. Holyoke, another urban area in the region, almost half its housing stock is pre-World War II. This is challenging for a number of reasons. One, the older housing that is rental, the odds of that being dilapidated housing is high. And we have some plans in our phase 2 to look at some of these issues of housing quality. There isn't a lot of great data on that. We are working with Jerry to look specifically at Springfield and what we can say about the city itself, but regionally there may be some limitations with that. But secondly is housing that was built after 1978 is much more likely to have lead paint, making an issue for renters with children under the age of 6, and particularly those with vouchers. So older housing stock has significant challenges, particularly for renters and for lower income residents, especially in instances where we're seeing dilapidated housing. In terms of housing prices, rent, and affordability, one of the things we wanted to highlight is that the heat of the local housing market recently, and in fact, this is a new data point that we've included in that is not actually in the study, but makes it to the presentation, is just how hot the housing market has been for sales since last March. The table here shows that in Pioneer Valley, prices have gone up 21% from March 2020 to March 2021. Franklin County, 13%, Hampshire County, 18%, and Hamden, 23%. So while sales saw a 24% decrease the first 2 months of the pandemic, that has completely shifted after settling in a bit into this pandemic. And in fact, and I'm sure all of you saw in Mass Live and the Springfield Republican doing a story just on April 19th on red hot Western Massachusetts housing market has pros asking, are these prices even realistic? And this has been a story everywhere, but has really been standing out in Pioneer Valley right now as the prices have gone up dramatically. Rent is a little harder to demonstrate, in part because there isn't the same uniform sources for rents as there is for sales. But looking at rent prices in the region, we are seeing increases in rent overall in Hampden and Hampshire counties. The data are a little funky. The stuff that we see on the left is the American Community Survey. So these rent prices might seem low to you, in part because the American Community Survey includes people who have been in their homes for multiple years and not specifically homes that have been listed for rent. So a list price tomorrow may be different than an old lady who's been renting a place for 10 years and her landlord doesn't up her rent all that often. But what we are seeing is an incremental climb in rent in the region. Similarly, MLS data shows rent prices going up in Pioneer Valley between 2015 and 2019.
You can't bring your dog. You come here. It'll be here when you get back.
MLS data is not comprehensive in terms of housing listings, but at least is a data point for us to point to show what's been happening with rents locally. Now, the big question, though, is affordability in general and achieving affordability for everyone. One of the ways we measure this is through a concept called housing cost burden. For everyone who pays for their housing, being able to find a place to live within your budget requires one of two things, or really two things. The cost being low enough and your income being high enough. So housing cost burden is a great measure to look at for considering that. A household is considered housing cost burdened if it's paying 30% or more of its income for housing. And they're severely housing cost burdened if they're paying 50% or more. So one of the important things to note here is while prices in the Pioneer Valley are low compared to Eastern Massachusetts, wages are also low. And the wages in the Pioneer Valley are lower or low enough that this housing burden really stands out as critical within the region. This graphic here looks at renters and owners and change in housing burden from 2010 to 2018. And a couple things I want to highlight here. And we have Massachusetts, Pioneer Valley in each of the counties. One of the things I want to highlight here has been the consistency of housing cost burden for renters. In 2010, we're in the middle of a recession. And in 2018, it's strong economic times. For renters, though, we see no change in their burden. Rents continue to go up, and they go up faster than their wages are increasing. So the level of burden is heavy for renters, and we see that very clearly here in this graphic, and it's happening all over the state. For owners, though, we see something quite different. In 2010, during the recession, there were more owners who were burdened, but over time, the percentage of owners that are burdened becomes smaller. This is obviously a very clear class issue. And for renters, where this adds to their challenges is that if you're spending over 50% of your income on rent, how are you saving money to potentially buy a home later? So we see this crisis. And then, of course, when you enter COVID into the ring, where renters may be losing their jobs and they were already stretched thin to begin with, you could see where the concern for people being housing instability being very clear. So in terms of cost burden in race and ethnicity, I want to highlight a few things here. At the top, you look at owners and the percent housing burdened for white, Black, Asian, and Hispanic for Massachusetts and Pioneer Valley. And what we see is actually in some instances in the Pioneer Valley for owners, the cost burdens being a bit lower. White folks, for Black folks, Asian is elevated, and then for Hispanic, it's low. But the challenge, of course, here is that only 30% of people of color in Pioneer Valley own their own home. That's compared to 37% for the state and 47% nationwide. So while we see this lack of housing cost burden for people of color in Pioneer Valley when they own their home, very few actually do. When we look at renters, on the other hand, the housing cost burdens are elevated and particularly high for Black and African American and Latinx folks. And then I'll transition to the projections. We did a straight line projection, looking at current population trends in the region and paired it with the housing production trends in the region as well, to understand the relationship between short-term household formation and the increase of housing supply in the region. And what we see here is that while in 2010, there was a surplus of housing in the region, particularly in Hampden County, that as you fast forward into time, over time, that there becomes a gap in housing supply. Why does this happen? Part of it is because of population growth, which has been modest in the Pioneer Valley, but will still occur. Part of it is a shifting age profile in the region as baby boomers age. What we're seeing is a slightly older age profile and different housing needs within a region. But most importantly, it's been slow housing production throughout Massachusetts. While Massachusetts has done a lot to add to housing stock, we haven't done enough, and we haven't been able to keep up with demand. And the lack of being able to keep up with demand has been a core factor in why we see prices rising all over the state. And then let me just transition lastly into talking about phase 2. So this was all a part of what we did as our phase 1 study. And it was really, as I talked about often, was a core metric scan of secondary data on the demographic, economic, and real estate conditions of the Pioneer Valley. What we're doing now is leveraging that work to further explore the relationship between racial economic disparity, the wealth divide, and housing in the Pioneer Valley, and with a particular focus on segregation and opportunity in the region. Greater Springfield is one of the most segregated regions in the country, particularly when it comes to white and Latinx populations. So we want to explore that more in its relationship to opportunity, barriers to home ownership, and housing production in general. And in particular, with this eye and lens towards a housing market as being regional. Springfield and Holyoke have had a ton of pressure on it for years to fill the gap for affordable housing in the region, which is not fair and is an important story to tell when it comes to creating housing opportunities for folks around a regional housing market. And then we plan in phase 2 to weave together vignettes highlighting the important role of affordability, quality of housing, quality of life, and social mobility, with possible vignettes around housing mismatch, impacts of COVID, and issues about housing conditions. So with that, I probably went a little long, but I'll stop there, and happy to take any questions and refer to Keith and others to weigh in as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melnick, for the overview. And as Dr. Melnick indicated, of course, there's a 52-page report, so we'll make sure it gets sent around for folks to review and digest more fully. But at this time, if folks do have questions, I would just ask that they raise their hand in the queue. And I do want to recognize some of the counselors that joined us during the presentation. Counselor Victor Davila, Counselor Tracy Whitfield, and Counselor Justin Hurst are all with us as well. And I have one question as folks are raising their hand. Do we have data on what percentage of Springfield specifically we anticipate is cost burden? And do we have the breakdown of the demographics in that regard?
I'd have to go back and refer to the report. That's possible to know. And Jerry, do you happen to know that off the top of your head?
We have that data. We put that data in our consolidated plan. So I don't know it off the top of my head, but I have it.
Okay, so I want to see that number, Jerry, if you could get it maybe while we're here, take a look at it. And we'll go now to Counselor Allen, and then Counselor Brown, and Counselor Davila.
Thanks, Mr. President or Mr. Chair. Thanks for the report. I'm Tim Allen. I represent Ward 7 in Springfield, but of course we everybody represents all of Springfield. We were looking at COVID-19 data yesterday, and we looked worse than the rest of the state. Looking at this today, and on broad glance, it looks worse than the rest of the state. We keep talking about there's more discrimination, et cetera, here. And these numbers, aren't making us look great. Maybe this is too deep of a question for this early in the conversation, but what do we do here? It's just, we're the city council. We have some influence on things in town, and it time and time again, Western Mass, Pioneer Valley, et cetera, looks worse on stuff. And if you're studying us, maybe you're studying other people as well, and finding some things they're doing that we aren't, et cetera. So that's the spirit of my question. We don't need to have that long discussion now because there's other people in queue, but I just want to get that out.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. I definitely want to get Keith's take on this. There's a few things about it. One is my hope, and I'm sure Keith's hope is a certain level of call to action out of this kind of work, because it's not insurmountable what some of the problems are. Naturally in urban areas, you always have a diverse set of occupations, incomes, housing types, racial and ethnic and whatever. And so these kinds of challenges present themselves. What I see as an opportunity within this is, one, as Keith highlighted at the beginning, some of the federal funding opportunities that are going to be coming down the pike. But the second part for me, and then obviously turn it over to you, Keith, but is I would love to see this report function as a type of regional bully pulpit, in a way of being able to advocate for Pioneer Valley together as a regional and as an economic entity. Because I think it's difficult when every municipality is doing their own guerrilla warfare. You're right, Councilor Allen, that what can this city council do, right? But there's this part of, if we think about the regional housing market as a system, then I do think there are ways of talking about enhancing production across a region that helps with prices, that helps with opportunity, and recognizing that housing is tied to economic development and transportation in a big way. Keith, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I would echo that. I think it's about getting ready for the resources that are both already available now through the American Rescue Plan Act, and then some of the resources that are coming from the feds, hopefully in the infrastructure bill or other legislation that's being proposed. To be very specific about that, one of the things that Mark called out was the home ownership gap in the region, especially for Black and Latinx households in the city of Springfield. In the Biden infrastructure plan, and it's a bipartisan bill that's in that plan, called the Neighborhood Homes Improvement Act, which would create a new tax credit program to spur the development of new homes in markets that are sometimes don't support the cost of new home development. It also supports the cost of rehabbing existing homes, and even support for homeowners who would need help for their homes. So this is a whole new tax credit program that could come to bear. And then there's thinking about also partnering and engaging the state. In fact, I was talking with Senator Keenan, who is the chair of the Joint Housing Committee at the state, just this afternoon about with some other folks about the conditions here in Western Massachusetts. So I think there's a real opportunity with the state also having resources. Certainly Springfield gets its own allocation of some of the federal resources, but there is a real opportunity here to plan for and advocate for more resources to meet the needs, and everybody, to Mark's point, using the data from the report to target the investments and make the case for getting the resources here in the region to solve for, because these are we have solvable numbers. These, you go to other parts of the state and the numbers are overwhelm you. These are not great numbers by percentage-wise compared to the state, but they're smaller. And so it's about really marshaling our capacity at the city of Springfield with the state, both inside government and outside government, in terms of being able to develop more, Development is one thing. I will say development takes a long time though. And we also need to look at other supply side, demand side things in terms of helping people who have vouchers and other things get placement of housing and so on. So I think there's a number of solutions out there. It is a long conversation, but it is something to begin preparing for and working together both within the city and then outside.
If I could add one thing too, and I remember joking with Keith about this last week about, the Greater Boston Housing Report Card has been in other regions. Well, one is Western Mass doesn't get this kind of attention when it comes to their housing market. It's usually a Boston thing, and this region has challenges. But I did point out the Greater Boston Housing Report Card has been produced for 20 straight years. So while they've been making the case, they have to keep making the case. So I think that's part of it too, is making that case and continuing to make it.
Thank you.
Councilor Allen. And to Councilor Allen's point, does the report include, or do you anticipate at some point developing any specific policy recommendations for local and state governments to adopt?
Yes, so that's the plan for as part of the outcome in phase 2. Because one of the things for us in phase 2, quite honestly, was we had conceived of this project in a few different ways. One was to do one giant report all at once. And then we ultimately decided to break it in half and to do like kind of a baseline analysis and then pivot to a deeper dive. And I think the deeper dive, which will include interviews and some novel data concepts, will allow us to leverage that information into a series of recommendations.
Thank you.
Yeah. But it's already,
go ahead, Keith.
I mean, some things are already pretty clear. You need more resources to produce more. And so the mechanisms for that may be different to the point. There are already some things at the state right now being considered around increasing the deeds excise tax, for example, that could increase revenue by about $300 million. So there are things already out there that could help with supply, and we have some existing tools around some other things, but I think those things could be tweaked and enhanced based upon more of our research and policy recommendations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferry. We'll go to Councilor Brown, followed by Councilor Davila, and then Councilor Gomez. Councilor Brown.
Thank you, Council. From a lot of the reports that I've been getting, just as far as like state stuff, I've always noticed that there was a big disparity when it comes to the actual screening of an applicant. So a lot of them, they don't have good credit, like the credit, you have to have a certain credit, and then you have to have 3 times the rent and things like that. Do you find, as far as the actual credit, the person's credit issues, do you find a lot of that is an issue also? Because I find it's a lot of it is the actual person when they're trying to even obtain even rental property and things like that, rent, that it's just the requirements, the credit itself is just now insane.
I can jump in there a little bit. We didn't do that through the report. I was just, again, on a different conversation today with Director Carnegie of the Mass Housing. He was talking about the home ownership gap in the Commonwealth overall for people of color, and she presented some pretty clear data about the disparities in terms of who gets more access to mortgages, even across income levels. When you compare comparable income levels all the way up into the 6 figures, there's still a differential, and the question in a differential by race in terms of who's getting approvals. And also what types of mortgage mechanisms people are using. Households of color, according to her analysis, were using more of the FHA mortgages, almost half of them, which are more costly. Whereas white households were only about 2% of them were using the FHA mortgage or some number like that. So it's a huge differential there. And so there are those discrepancies and disparities along racial and ethnic lines when you look at the mortgages and home ownership.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Councilor Letterman.
Thank you, Councilor Brown. Councilor Davila, followed by Councilor Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Melnick, thank you for that wonderful report. I look forward to getting a copy of it so that we can further digest information and the numbers. But I got two questions. One is, if I'm not mistaken, I believe I saw on the projected gap, housing gap chart that in Massachusetts by 2025, we're going to have negative 13,000 and some change. Do you have data as to what that's going to look like for Springfield specific?
We do actually, and hold on 1 second. We do actually have the housing gap for individual municipalities. So I would say check out the report, and I'm seeing if I can find the graphic for that. While I look for it, why don't you ask your second question?
Sure, thank you, Dr. Melnick. My second question is regarding the cost burden. The data was very clear that most of the burden falls on the Afro-American and the Latinos, particularly on both the renters and the homeowners. It's my fear that as we start going post-pandemic, that the foreclosure is going to skyrocket.
Right.
I obviously Springfield in the past has had, I believe, 2 or 3 rounds of help to the wayfinders, helping both homeowners and renters to stay at home. I would welcome some sort of a policy recommendation as to how we can deal with this long term, because I do think that, of course, we all know that to get out of this economic crisis that this pandemic has created, it's going to take time. It's not going to be done overnight. So I would love to see some sort of a policy recommendation for the long term, and also in the short term, kind of brainstorming here as thinking outside of the box as we are discussing this important issue. With some of this money of the new Recovery Act, I don't recall, because I know we're just trying to get the specifics of what it can be used for. If some of that money could be reallocated to continue helping people, homeowners, stem off the potential foreclosure. And maybe that's a question for Tim Sheenan, if he's, I believe I saw him on the call, or you, Mr. Melnick.
Great. So let me, I can't find the graphic on the individual communities, but take a look in the report, and Councilman Lederman, I think I'm assuming you have the link and you can share it around. But we did do disaggregates and then aggregate it up. To your question about foreclosure, your comment about foreclosure, I wholly agree with you that the federal and state and local responses as it relates to foreclosure and eviction avoidance was wonderfully proactive, but a lot of it was kicking the can down the road. And what it is doing is what I think the opportunity that's been presented is that there are actions the government can take to help with community stability and helping with avoiding people losing their homes. I think from a policy perspective, I would argue, and I know that in another piece of work that we're doing now that I don't want to get too far ahead of, we are arguing about higher levels of funding put into eviction avoidance and foreclosure avoidance as a result of this pandemic, and recognizing that the pandemic is a unique and terrible event, but on the other hand, the ability to create stability in communities is critical. And so putting resources into that space is going to be important for our low and moderate income residents regardless, because right now we have a pandemic, but we saw 10 years ago, the Great Recession, what that did to communities, and the economic effect was a blip compared to what happened here. So it is important for us to be proactive in those ways. And I think a lot of that has to come from the feds. Obviously, they have a lot more money than state government does and local government does, but those are proactive things. And I'm hoping through this pandemic and through some of the signals from the Biden administration recognizing the importance of supporting vulnerable communities.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, we do have outsized eviction prevention resources right now, greater both that came through the December COVID-19 relief package, which is $25 billion, and then another $20 billion in the American Rescue Plan Act. From the state of Massachusetts, that's going to be around $700 million, and that money is going to be around for the next couple of years. So I'm not, and right now, just to bring it all the way to Springfield and to the work that we do at Wayfinders around that, we're stewarding, including both resources that the city of Springfield has helped us with their allocations of some resources, and other municipalities, but primarily with the state. We're stewarding about $40 million to keep people housed right now. We put about 20 million of that to work in our region. The largest proportion of that money is going to the residents of the city of Springfield. And we use the challenge, most of that is around evictions. So when you're talking about mortgages, we were able to work with the city to get some more support for homeowners. The state does have a program, and to your point, we need to continue, have to ask them to continue this program for longer than the immediate relief period here. That program, the Emergency Rental and Mortgage Assistance Program, otherwise known as IRMA, which goes alongside RAFT and goes to a higher AMI, that we need to continue. Because as you say, you know, the shoe on evictions and foreclosures hasn't dropped yet. There's a longer lead for that. And I think there'll be a need for those resources down the road.
Yeah, Keith, just a quick follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chair. With regards to the evictions for the renters, would you happen to know if we've seen a sharp increase?
Oh, we're seeing a sharp decrease?
Increase on evictions. Yeah.
There are, you know, the courts are active in terms of filings. I think the eviction diversion initiative. So there's a lot of summary processing cases proceeding to a point. Because we have all these resources, the courts are directing people in court if they have not applied for emergency rental assistance. We actually have people who sit in housing court and they direct them virtually sit in housing court. They direct them to us to apply. So I feel like there is, while there are some non-payment cases, and I just, there were some that are getting to eviction, unfortunately. There is a process, though, even at that late state, to get those resources in court. And I do have a concern that we're going to see more of that, especially with the news today, if the CDC moratorium is scuttled by the courts here, that more people will end up in court. So it is concerning. We're looking at it, and we still see very high volume of applications to us for evictions and for rental arrears. Today we got 80 folks applied to us today, just in this one day. For the last 2 months, we've been getting about 400 to 500 applications a week.
All right, thank you, Keith. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Davila. We're going to go to Councilor Gomez, but just quickly, I saw Director McCaffrey raise her hand. Did you want to come in on that particular question, Director, or did you have something else?
I have just to say, I have seen data year over year, and evictions are actually down this year, I think because there is so much money for eviction relief, and there is so much, and the moratorium, first what was done prior to the CDC, what was done statewide, and then what is done here. So we have lower numbers than usual of eviction, but as you know, were those things not there, I think we'd have overwhelming numbers.
Yep.
So just wanted to pass that on.
Thank you, Director. Councilor Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In seeing the numbers in the graphic and seeing that the future is not too bright for homeowners and renters, my question has to do with how people that are renting units out and the non-rent control is going to affect us into the future, because I can see renters trying to work here in the situation and putting more dollars in their pockets in rents. And there's going to be an awful lot of people who are not going to be able to afford those rents. And again, we're going to have a whole lot of people in court trying to be evicted by us not having a rent control within the city or the state. I think that's the case. What do we do in a situation like this?
Well, one of the things that Mark pointed out, I'll let Mark jump in here, but the key thing here to recognize right now too is that we have, at least in terms of the unemployment rate, is still quite high. So many of the folks hopefully will be getting back to work. Unemployment rate is over 10% still for the city of Springfield, last I checked. About 10% for Holyoke. And so not only do we have the eviction prevention resources that I talked about, and those will be around for a while. So there are also some other resources in the American Rescue Plan Act, including an emergency voucher program that goes through a $5 billion program there that goes through 2030. So it's not a permanent voucher like the Section 8 program or other things, but there are some other supports that are emerging, will be emerging in the state in the coming months ahead that could help people, sustain people as they get back on their feet. But I think advocating for more of things like that, again, I was advocating for more Massachusetts rental vouchers today and changing some of the differential there to make sure that people are, that levels up with Section 8, for example, instead of people paying 40% of their income, it pays 30% of their income. But it always comes back to not only is there enough affordable housing, is there enough housing, period? And right now we see a housing supply gap that's still going to be a challenge for us to solve for.
Right. And that was a good setup, Keith, because one of the things I was going to say is like part of it is having resources and policies in place to help with stability, right? And we have some of those and continuing them, but then it's also trying to help with the increase in supply. So I do think that housing choice is a great step in the right direction in terms of increasing housing production in different communities. I think that there's also the, pressure on communities that use exclusionary zoning practices to reduce the number of affordable, not affordable housing, but housing that is affordable units, whether it's multi-unit housing that's built in some suburban communities or smaller lots and smaller. So all of this is a part of a complicated puzzle that ties together. So, part of it is keeping, it's not to anyone's benefit for there to be community instability, people being kicked out of their homes, right? So there's helping people there in the short run, but it's also the long-term issue of how to create enough housing that we have naturally affordable housing occurring in the region. And to me, for a broad public policy question that comes up in a lot of our work, I often talk about what it's like to be low and moderate income in a high cost state. And Massachusetts is a high cost state. Our housing is expensive, right? And, we're always going to have low and moderate income people and in jobs that pay less than other jobs, right? But you need all of these people together in a workforce. And so how do you make it possible for low and moderate income people to make ends meet in a state like this? And I think housing is such a core part of that story, and it's production and its supports.
I can see that the 3070 will be no problem. And that was not the folks I was talking about. I'm talking about those folks that are not in 3070 and are renting, even though they have a job possible or whatever. But if this rents are coming up and we're saying rents are going up and salaries are down, these people will not be able to afford this rent because this renters are going to push that rent up. And I can see that happening.
Right. No, and it's happened in a lot of places. It's a huge concern.
And I to that point too, one of the things I'm sorry, Councilor Gomez, I didn't mean to go ahead.
I'm finished. Thank you.
To that same point too, one of the things that I think about is as the housing market continues to rise here and in the Eastern Mass area. We saw this with the onset of the pandemic of folks leaving larger cities looking for more what is affordable to them housing in these regions. And I think that as we look at the investments in rail that are proposed, which are valuable investments, but I actually think that something that we need to be planning for and that has not been talked about as much is what impact that does have. While it will give us more access to possibly higher paying jobs in the eastern part of the state or in other parts of the Northeast, it will also bring more individuals here looking for what is affordable to them and is already perhaps outpacing what we're looking at here. So I would encourage possibly in the second part of your study to consider that as well. I know we're heading here towards the end of our hearing. I do want to bring in Jerry and Tim, Director McCaffrey and Director Sheehan, if you want to give some of your reaction to this. I know you've heard the presentation several times, and what are your thoughts on it? What are you working on right now that we should know about, and how can we support you also in those endeavors?
I'm happy to go first, Jerry. I agree. One of the fundamental issues is increasing the supply. I think that's got to be a long-term objective within the city and regionally. In answer to Councilor Davila's question, there are resources available in the rescue plan, extensive resources available for housing. And I think there's sufficient in scale to be able to work towards alleviating the crisis that we have. But there are going to be long-term issues, as Councilor Gomez brought up, with regards to housing. The appreciation of that rental product in the marketplace is accelerating beyond where our incomes are. And we need to carefully be looking at that over the years ahead, and trying to figure out, from a public policy standpoint, what's the best way to try and ensure that there's housing availability for every income level within the city. And I think, the interesting thing is you look at the availability within the marketplace, and the rental product, I believe the number was about 5%. I mean, that's a pretty good number to be at. You don't want to have vacancy numbers that are way above that number, because that's telling you that your housing market isn't healthy. But I think over the next couple of years, that number is probably going to get even further constrained, because as Dr. Melnick said, it takes time to bring that new product online. Projects take, scalable projects that would have, a significant influence on the numbers are 2 years in terms of construction. So that's a bit of a challenge. But those were my observations.
I think, let's see, a couple of things in my mind. One is, I was struck that that the initial reaction was that this is all bad news, because maybe it's that there wasn't a lot that was news to me. I knew a lot of these trends, but I think one of the things that is happening now, we struggled a long time with vacancy and abandonment of housing. And that was because there was no demand for housing. We now have demand, and we have prices going up. It does mean that our neighborhoods are more stable. We are able to address vacant housing. We have been able to put uses into properties that were empty before. And we don't have nearly the degree of problem with landlords walking away from properties. So it is the flip of, with some good news comes bad impacts, because there is going to be the affordability question. So I think that's one thing that strikes me. Another thing that strikes me is, so we've been talking for a while about the overall Pioneer Valley issue of segregation, how people of color are in Holyoke and Springfield and are not anywhere else in the Pioneer Valley. And I think one of the things I saw in this report was how much that means that the way we have divided by race and ethnicity, and we've also divided by home ownership and rental property, we have created a place where we have affordable rental and then plus naturally affordable rental, which is now pretty old and dilapidated, and it's all concentrated in one place. It means that the impact of all these decisions over so many decades means that the burden of housing problems fall so much on people of color. And in a region like ours, that means they fall on the cities of Springfield and Holyoke. So we do have the challenge for the region. I want to say, though, to end on another positive note, the other thing that's really positive right now is this is the first time, you know, I've been doing this with the city for 15 years. This is the first time we have anywhere near this kind of resources coming into solving housing problems. So I think that's a really exciting and hopeful thing.
Well, thank you very much for your insight to both the directors, and we are approaching 6:15. I do want to be respectful of folks' time, but are there any other counselors that wanted to share anything before I close us out?
Councilor Liederman, could I clarify too?
Sure, Doctor.
One quick thing. I forget which counselor it was. Maybe it was DeVella was asking about the gap in the city. The demand graphic is on page 9, and it's figure 31. We do not have the gap for the city in the report, but it is something that I just reached out to my co-author on this, and she says that we suppressed it because of small areas within the region, but she thinks that we'd be able to pull it out for Springfield. So let me do a little bit of work on that, and I think it's something I can, Councilor Liederman, I have your email address, so I can follow up with you about that, because I think it's a good question. I think we didn't want to get into the business of having it for Agawam and all the small places, and then you know, but I think for Springfield, because it's so large, the data would be clean.
And do we have the cost burden rate and demographic breakdown? Director McCaffrey, you're going to get that for us. Okay. All right. Well, seeing no other hands from counselors, I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Melnick and Director Ferry for being with us, and to our directors and all the counselors that joined. You know, I think that, you know, for folks who may not work in this space every day, as many of you do, you know, this is a wake-up call. But I think it also needs to be a call to action. And I think that it puts us in a strong position to demand that investment from the state and federal government and put into play, I think, many of the initiatives that have been talked about for a long time or that have maybe gotten off the ground but could use a shot in the arm. You know, I think of, you know, the how far we have come, as Director McCafferty spoke about, in terms of trying to see a vacant property be put back into use. But I think we also all know that in our neighborhoods, we still do have properties that need attention. And I think that, you know, every single one of those is an opportunity to build that stock up. And with the investment we're seeing from local and state, and coming into local and state governments from the federal government, I think that's where we need to be focusing our direct attention right now and making sure that cities like Springfield are not left behind. So I hope that this will not be our last conversation on this. I'll look forward to continuing to work with Councilor Brown and Councilor Edwards and all the councilors to bring these three committees together, because I think they are all relevant to seeing this through and continue to support our city staff and directors who work on this every single day. So thank you all, and we'll look forward to coming back with phase 2 and those recommendations in the near future. And I'll be talking with counselors around what we may be able to do in the interim as well from the legislative end of things. So thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you.